Every time Carlos and I are together, we like to watch at least one absurd Prager U video. Seems to be something that we work into the schedule every time. So this one's called "What Was the Cold War?" This will be perfect. It's a short video. It's only 6 minutes. It's about the Cold War, which I would say is my number one area of expertise. And it's Prager U, so you know it's going to be hilariously dumb and easy to debunk. So, yeah. Any thoughts before we get started, Carlos?
I just wanted to pull up a comment here that I found hilarious. The blockade doesn't exist, but also it's justified. And if socialism is so great, Cuba should be like Wakanda, despite the blockade. Gusano, logic. He's of course being ironic, right?
Yes.
um,
That's hilarious. All right, I guess I'll hit play on the PragerU vid.
From the end of World War II, the United States and its Western European allies were involved in a nearly half-century-long titanic struggle with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. It was cold only in the sense that the Russians and Americans never came to direct blows, but it was certainly not cold for the Cubans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and others who got caught up in the communists' relentless drive to destabilize the free, democratic, capitalist world.
Free, democratic, capitalist, words that all mean the same thing. It's actually a good point that the war wasn't cold for much of the global south and much of the countries like Korea where there was all this fighting. But it was never the Soviet Union invading, right? It was the Soviet Union would support grassroots revolutionary movements that propped up on their own. And then like in Korea, the US would bomb 20% of the population, destroy the infrastructure, back a fascist dictatorship, manufacture a voting plan at the UN to split the country in half, occupy it. It was always, or like in Afghanistan, the Soviets were there trying to stabilize things and build hospitals and schools and help this Marxist democratic government take power when there were all these extremist groups and separatist groups. And then the US funnels a bunch of arms and weapons to Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen so they could just massacre like literacy workers and stuff. So it's always like, there was a tweet the other day that said studying the Cold War is like, so the revolutionaries, the communists, with the help of the Soviet Union, taught a bunch of people to read. And then the US gave a bunch of arms to terrorists who killed those people. And then Western academics are like, the communists are to blame. They shouldn't have taught those darn people to read. They were destabilizing the democratic free world.
Right. I love the association of those three words: free, democratic, capitalist. It only makes sense if in front of free and democratic, like capital. That's the only way it makes sense. Freedom of capital. Capitalist democracy, the democracy of money, right? Instead of the demos, right, which is people in Greek, you should put capital kratasy, or it just doesn't make any fucking sense, because the word democracy means demos and kratos, power. Demos is people, but it's not just people and vague. It's common people. It's poor people. It's the masses. It's in Spanish what you call it pueblo. And democracy, you cannot have it without socialism. Socialism is the only real form of democracy. And the way that these idiots lump words like freedom, democracy, to capitalism, it's just insane. It's an upside down world, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect way to think about it. And I mean, if you don't think about it already like that, when bourgeois ideologues say freedom, they mean freedom of capital. Start thinking about it that way next time you hear them talk about freedom, and it makes perfect sense, because the neoliberals, the Milton Friedmanites, literally equate freedom with free markets, no social safety net, free trade, capital is allowed to invest, no labor regulations. The freer that capital is, the more that these neoliberals and capitalist ideologues or bourgeois ideologues will say that, there's freedom. Like in Chile, Allende was planning all these social welfare programs that Pinochet wiped out and allowed Western multinationals to pillage Chile, bringing unemployment up to like 20% and all these negative effects for the masses. But that's what the neoliberals point at and say is the best economy ever, the laboratory of neoliberalism. But all it did was provide maximum freedom for Western banks and Western multinationals. So, we always have to ask, freedom and democracy for what class?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is a good comment. Freedom of enterprise that doesn't inhibit my personal business, and democracy for me and my buddies to choose what's best for us.
Cuba is not a democracy now that the masses vote on referendums to decide their policy. It was a democracy when Western gangsters and capitalists used Havana as a brothel and casino, and made all the decisions and had slaves. That is democracy.
Even in their shallow view of democracy, which is just electoralism, the ability to vote, it doesn't make any fucking sense. In presidential elections, around 60 to 65% of Americans vote. In any election in Cuba, local, national, regional, you got 95% of people voting. 95% of people voting, and it's usually 97% of people in favor. Sometimes it's not like that. On social issues, the recent family code, it was 66 in favor, 44 against. But it's ridiculous. In local elections, you know what percentage of Americans participate? 27. It's like basically 3/4 of the population not engaged at all in local politics. And that's even just thinking about democracy in their very shallow way of thinking about it, as just, going to the booth, pressing a button every other year, every 2 years, every 4 years. Even by their standards, they're not democratic. And that's why every recent study that comes out from even Ivy League schools, which are the institutions of bourgeois hegemony, even those studies show concretely that there's nothing near democracy in the US. What you have is an oligarchy, a small group of people who control the wealth, and because they have the wealth, they can decide what the fuck goes in politics. That's it. That's what you have.
Yeah, there was a recent third-party there's a third-party study that's done every so few years or so, asking people where they feel like their government serves them, where they feel like they actually have control, where it's the most democratic. And Cuba and China are top 10 in the world, and the U.S. ranks near the bottom, like 160th or something. So, yeah, even by the U.S.'s own standards of democracy, Cuba blows us out of the water. Yeah, and there's been an Ivy League study to say we're an oligarchy.
There were, to be sure, many morally complex moments during this long struggle, but the Cold War was, at its core, as clear a conflict of good versus evil as World War II had been. Just like that war, the Cold War was a death match between the forces representing freedom and the forces representing totalitarianism.
Just like World War II, it was a battle of good and evil. You had the Soviets who fought, or who dealt 80% of the Nazi casualties, and then you had the U.S. and Britain who filtered Nazi officials and higher-ups into their institutions of power, and carried on this giant hegemonic global empire which underdeveloped the entire global South. Just like World War II, the West are the good guys, and those Soviets who fought against capitalism and who fought against the Nazis in World War II, they are evil, plain and simple.
Right, because according to these guys, the Soviets are as bad as the Germans, right? And the Western, if you look back at before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin was warning that they should fight against Hitler. And the West did not want to fight against Hitler. They wanted Hitler to invade. Could we say Hitler?
Yeah, we can on YouTube and Twitch.
Okay. They wanted him to invade. They wanted Germany to invade the Soviet Union. They wanted each country to fight against each other so that one of them would be destroyed, and then they would fight against whichever one was destroyed. So they did not want to fight against fascism. They did not want to fight against Nazism. It was the communists who were the first ones to fight against fascism and Nazism. And the way that they just take this term, which comes from progressive liberals like Hannah Arendt, totalitarianism, in order to equivocate the Soviet Union and fascism, or communism and fascism, It's absolutely ridiculous. It is the epitome of bourgeois abstract thinking, which sees things completely divorced from any context, from any relations, from any interconnections, from any processes, from anything. It just sees, oh, state bad, two-state bad, totalitarianism, both bad. What? It's so incredibly stupid. It's so incredibly stupid. It sees the repression of one state, which represses the people fighting for freedom and minorities and marginalized communities, and it equates it to the repression of another state, which is in control of the people, repressing the enemies of freedom, repressing spies and people trying to overthrow a popular democratic socialist revolution. It's
And
the
that's
same.
And that's what the idea of totalitarianism itself is. This concept of totalitarianism, which you see right here, freedom versus totalitarianism. It's conflating, the Soviet Union with the Nazis and saying these are both totalitarian. They're not different systems. They're not systems that were in conflict and fought against each other. They're the same dictatorship. And it ignores all the evidence and all the real factors, all the material factors. That's just a completely ridiculous way of thinking about things. But this idea has been propped up by the CIA and the ruling class for so long now. And, this book, which was heavily funded and supported by the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, called The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, came out right after World War II, so they could push this stupid, wrong idea, that the Nazis and the Soviets are the same. So therefore, we're justified in doing whatever we want during the Cold War as long as it stops the spread of communism. We got to kill 20% of Korea's population in the name of human rights to prevent totalitarianism, which is a stupid, meaningless concept that doesn't mean anything. And, you have this book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The origins of totalitarianism are right here. This is the origin of totalitarianism, this dumbass CIA-backed book that kicked off the Cold War ideology. The Soviet Union was nothing like Nazi Germany, which is why they fought against Nazi Germany. But this concept of totalitarianism is so useful for the capitalists. And that's why it's still in use today. That's why 70 years later, the numbnuts over at Prager U still haven't come up with anything new. There's like, ooh, totalitarianism, socialism, authoritarian. And it's an easy argument to debunk, but yeah, it's useful. And a lot of people, still believe this, even though, Prescott Bush, this corporatist who made all his money allying with the Nazi parties in Germany, was George Bush's grandpa. And now we've had two Bushes in office. They were trying to put Jeb Bush in office. We have like literal Nazi oligarchs still running our government. But we're the good guys and the Soviets are the bad guys. Sure.
Right. Can I pull up a quick quote?
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed this, but the StreamYard changed share to present.
Yeah.
They're going bourgeois on us. Share, that's the socialist one. When we nationalize it, we'll go back to share. But let me click on present. This is something that I have my students read. But this is from Maximilien Robespierre and a speech he gave on the justification of the use of terror. And it's from 3 months before they killed him. So listen to this quote. It has been said that terror is the principle of despotic government. Does your government therefore resemble despotism? Yes, as the sword that gleams in the hands of the heroes of liberty resembles that which the henchmen of tyranny are armed. Let the despot governed by terror by his brutalized subject. He is right as a despot. Subdue by terror the enemies of liberty, and you will be right as the founders of the republic. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny, is force made only to protect crime, and is the thunderbolt not destined to strike the heads of the proud. So it's pretty badass, because it's like, yeah, sure, totalitarianism. If you want to consider the sword of the freedom fighter the same as the sword of the person that decapitates fucking poor people. I guess it's the same. I guess, totalitarianism, haha, and that it's just abstract thinking. Oh, two facts look similar. They're the same. Forget about everything else.
Right. Not when they could just read like a 3-page writing from Engels called On Authority, and they wouldn't have all these dumbass misconceptions.
Right.
Because hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in it, the Cold War can, with good reason, be described as the Third World War. The instigator of this war was Joseph Stalin, the mass-murdering dictator of Russia and of the many non-Russian peoples he had incorporated into what was known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. Stalin knew that his Soviet armed forces could not take on the might of the Free West. Instead, he decided to wage this fight through the use of proxies and by a massive use of disinformation.
So this is all projection, like the US always does. They were doing proxy wars. No, they weren't. They were funding and helping revolutionary movements who were battling the Contras or the Syngam government in Korea, or the US-backed forces in Vietnam, who were terroristic, US-armed, US-backed right-wing neoliberal forces. And the U.S. was waging hybrid wars, proxy wars, or just real wars. And, this guy says, maybe even 1 million people died in the Cold War. Like the U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Korea. The U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Cambodia. The U.S. committed genocide in Cambodia. The U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Vietnam. Like the death count from these proxy wars is absurd. And it's well over, the number of people who died in the Soviet Union. And, of course, they have to bring up Stalin and act like somehow Stalin claimed control of all of Russia, plus all of the Soviet states himself, and he just forced everyone into this position, which reminds me of something that that I read today in Socialism and the Man in Cuba, the Che book, where Che talks about how hard it is to consolidate support of the people. And how hard it is to create a state apparatus that actually is connected to the masses and connected to the people. And he says anytime the socialist government starts to become disconnected from the people, you see discontent, right? People no longer support the revolution. People have criticisms, and they'll get mad. So in order to keep the revolution going, you always have to remain connected to the people and act in the interests of the people. And Derek Ford, who told us a lot about his time in North Korea, he was saying, like, if North Korea was what the U.S. actually said it was, the people would have risen up right now, right? Like nobody would allow themselves to, no entire country of people would just be ruled by this one guy, with an iron fist. The communist and socialist revolutions have to consolidate support of the people. That was the number one goal of the Chinese Communist Party after the revolution. Consolidate the people's support. So if Stalin's just murdering people left and right for fun without reason, he wouldn't have stayed in power. The reason Stalin had such a cult of personality was because he so thoroughly, served the revolution, served the workers and the people every step of the way. And yes, a cult of personality developed around that, because he was greatly admired by the working class. But that developed not because he was disconnected from the people, this iron fist ruler, but because he was connected to them, and he was literally a working class person himself.
Oh my god, it's so funny to hear about the cult of personality when, like, around me there's like fucking 6 houses with 3,000 DeSantis flags.
Right.
but that's so absolutely ridiculous. It is so ridiculous, and it is grounded on Eurocentrism and Western racism, because it holds the people of the East and of the global South who had socialist projects of construction, it holds them as too stupid and too weak to overthrow their dictatorial rulers, but yet at the same time, paradoxically, so strong that they can wage these iron fist dictatorships and kill millions and millions of people. It's these paradoxes of racism and of Eurocentrism, of American exceptionalism, which ground the ideology with which the West and the capitalist imperialist world looks at the East.
Absolutely.
And misinformation. His initial prey was Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as well as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Stalin had troops in all these countries at the end of the war. Despite what he promised American President Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader had no intention of removing them, and gaining control over their governments proved to be quite easy. In March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. When Stalin threatened both Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman finally had enough. The so-called Truman Doctrine was born. The United States and its allies would not permit.
After years and years of Soviet aggression, Truman had finally had enough, ignoring the fact that every Western power landed troops in Russia right after the revolution to try and destroy the workers' government before it even got off the ground. Ignoring all the sanctions that the U.S. put on them, and the proxy war that they tried to wage against the Soviet Union. It was all for the sake of human rights. And it's funny too that they say that Stalin had troops all over. Stalin had troops in all these countries. That's proof that he's imperialist. Okay, the U.S. has 1,000 foreign military bases, and the second most or the country with the second most military bases, I think, is Russia with like 12. So you just admitted that the U.S. is the worst, most violent imperialistic force in the history of the world, because you said if someone has troops somewhere, that means they're imperialist. And also, I like I always think it's interesting when ruling class ideologues use the word misinformation. That's like the new conspiracy theory. Everybody who doesn't agree with us is a conspiracy theorist, and they're spreading misinformation. And we covered a video, or I did a video today on TikTok responding to this article from the Brookings Institute, which is a conservative think tank funded by billionaires. But they said they were talking about how podcasters are spreading Russian propaganda, and saying that there's no evidence Russia blew up their own pipeline, but there is evidence that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And the Brookings Institute was saying these are conspiracy theories being spread by podcasters when, quote unquote, the majority of experts believe Russia did it. And then you click on the little experts tab on their page, and it's Western bankers and financial executives and former State Department officials, one of whom worked with Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton, and they were bragging about that in their Brookings Institute profile. So it's like these experts are lying imperialist ghouls who are willing to kill as many people as they need to make a quick buck, and anybody who questions them is the conspiracy theorist.
Right, and it's one of the things that Chomsky notes, and of course we have some criticisms of Chomsky, but he's right to say that, even a basic level of decency to avoid hypocrisy is absent from these people. Right? How can you talk about, Soviet troops in places of the world when your country has 900 bases around the planet? How can you talk about that? What? You're a fucking hypocrite. That's what it is. And Chomsky's right. Even if they were at least halfway decent people that didn't want to be hypocrites, they could be like, well, okay, this one bad, but we're also shit. That's at least, someone not hypocritical. I think it's wrong, but it's just complete an assault on human reason, and an assault on human decency. How hypocritical these fucking liars are. They're just liars. They're lying their ass off, and they know that they're lying.
They do. They have to. I mean, at this level, when you're talking about Prager U people, like, they know what the U.S. military does around the world. They're the people who fund the Atlantic Council and these, literal mouthpieces of imperialism. They're the people who are invested in the military-industrial complex. They're the ones making money off war. Guys like this, which makes it even more disgusting when they come out here and defend it. And it's like, the level of lies and hypocrisy. But I mean, to be a warrior for your class as a capitalist living in modern day, you just have to be a piece of shit liar. You have to be an American psycho, basically. So now we have people like this and Dennis Prager.
Someone brought up Jeffrey Sachs. I'm trying to find the...
I did a video on that already. I just uploaded it to our YouTube, actually.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to say real quick that Jeffrey Sachs is what you get when you're just a halfway decent human being with good intentions and some critical thinking skills. You don't have to be a Marxist. But if you have somewhat the interest of human beings at heart, and he considers himself philosophically an Aristotelian aligned with the pragmatist tradition, and you have some critical thinking skills, you end up like Jeffrey Sachs, which is, largely, I don't think I've seen a video of him missing. Maybe that's because the ones that pop up are just the ones where he hits the nail on the head. But he's almost always in the same position politically in terms of geopolitical analysis as Marxist-Leninists who apply the dialectical materialist method correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to watch the video I did on that after this, we can. It's really short, like a TikTok, but yeah, you can tell he's like nervous when he's on Bloomberg because he knows that they're probably going to react like that, but he's literally just telling the truth. Like he's literally just stating very basic facts and they flip out.
My question is, how do they still let him go on? Because he's been doing it for like a while.
Right. I quote him in my Venezuela thesis a bunch. He's like one of the most cited economists in there. He's been at it for a while.
Right. Pretty soon you won't see as much of him because I don't think they want to keep having him on. It's too. You can tell they don't. Like they rush to get him off air.
Yeah, I think the Bloomberg people literally pulled him when the most recent one was going on.
Right. I don't think he's going to get much airtime pretty soon. People are going to catch up, and they expect this big Columbia professor to be ideologically aligned with Empire. And then, just because he's a decent human being who can think critically, he's consistently in a position that's, at least through his geopolitical analysis, anti-imperialist.
Right. He's a decent and honest human being.
Right.
Which, yeah, his credentials make it seem like he's maybe right-wing, but then you talk to him and he's not.
Any further expansion of the communist empire. The Cold War was on. For the next 5 decades and across 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, the US and the Soviet Union battled for influence, sometimes overtly, like in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes covertly through their various spy agencies. But the moral lines of this battle never changed. The freedom of the West versus the communist tyranny of the Soviet East. There are, nonetheless, as there were even at the time, those who argue that the Cold War was an overreaction by the West, that the ambitions and strength of the Soviet bloc were greatly exaggerated, and that America, with its massive defense build-up, was just as responsible for the Cold War as was the Soviet Union. But this simply isn't true, as an immense amount of archival evidence from Russia, not available until after the Cold War ended, now proves. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, stated Soviet intentions plainly in 1956. "We will bury you," he told the West. Nor would any amount of negotiation.
I mean, to take a quote that small, like, and take it out of context and be like, he said, "We will bury you." He could have been talking about like a dog, or like it is such a small quote. And you have mountains and mountains and mountains of Marxist literature that the Soviet Union produced and based their society on. Like, let's just ignore all that and pick out the "We'll bury you" line. And the U.S. and Soviets did not battle for Korea and Vietnam. The Soviets were not battling for Korea and Vietnam. The U.S. was massacring people, dropping Agent Orange and napalm on them and bombing their infrastructure. And the Soviets gave mild support to the democratically supported revolutionary movements in those areas, while the U.S. was supporting right-wing extremist separatist forces. or not separatist forces, but right-wing extremist pro-US forces. And also just there's literally no argument in this PragerU video.
None.
There's no argument at all. There's no evidence, and like this kind of stuff makes people dumber because you don't know how to argue. There's no evidence. Just freedom-loving West versus dictatorial communist Soviet Union. That's it. That's the end of the argument. And this is how a lot of Americans think. And it's interesting once you start questioning them, like, why do you think that about the Soviet Union? Why do you think that about China? They can't explain it. They have no friggin' idea. They're just like, 1 million people died and communism was evil, bad because of stuff like this. There's no evidence, no facts. They just repeat over and over and over again in a high volume. Communism evil, communism dictatorship, communism doing proxy wars and undemocratic, and everything that capitalism is, actually, that's communism.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's what I was thinking about. He says, that is just not true. And then I'm like, okay, let's see the argument. No argument. Just all he said was, the archives prove it. What the fuck? Imagine you come towards me and you tell me something, I tell you, that's just not true. Go talk to Bill. How is that convincing? That's not an argument. That's not an argument. That's an appeal to authority, to these archives that have been shown to have been tampered a lot of the times by the right wing and the reactionaries that took power after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. That's just a fact. That is a fact. That a lot of those archives were tampered.
Factual. And it's the same argument like as the Brookings Institute saying, the expert said this about Russia. Okay, there's literally zero evidence, and an overwhelming amount of evidence points to the fact that the U.S. did it. But if you bring up evidence, you're a conspiracy theorist. These experts who are actually just State Department officials and Western banking executives, they are the arbiters of truth.
Right.
Negotiation, détente, as it was called then, have led to a just conclusion of the war. The American diplomat George Kennan rightly warned that short of becoming a communist country, there was nothing the United States could do to gain the Kremlin's trust. The Soviets could not be appeased, only contained. But even containment was an inadequate strategy. Yes, the Soviet Union could not have beaten the US in a head-to-head confrontation, but it didn't have to. Victory in the Cold War would have allowed it, through intimidation and subversion, to dominate the globe, making communism, rather than democracy and capitalism, the preeminent ideology.
It's like they're so scared of communism and socialism because they know it is the future, the right way to move forward. And they're like, it would spread all over if we didn't massacre everybody who supported it.
Right. And I can't help but think, like, imagine if Midwestern Marx had like the funds in order to have nice little videos like this, but except that instead of having like non-arguments, we would have arguments and these streams, but like really, really nice designs. I was looking at the design, I'm like, damn, that's dope. That's why people follow these idiots. You have a nice fucking dude with a haircut and a suit, and then you have really nice graphic designs. That's how you sell, people in an age where the TikTokization of the brain has occurred.
Yeah, it's like those infographics videos I always react to, where it's just these little cartoons of, Stalin murdering 1 million people, and this is what history was, but it's short and bite-sized. People eat it up.
Yeah.
There were many times during the 5 decades of the war that it seemed like this would be the case. But thanks primarily to the strong leadership shown by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Soviet Union was, at the close of the 1980s, to use historian Paul Johnson's description, a bewildered giant, economically bereft, militarily exhausted, no longer able or willing to enforce its will. Communism had failed in every possible way, economically, politically, morally. It had tried to create a utopia on Earth and instead created hell for all of the nations that came under its sway. Yes, the forces of liberty eventually won the Cold War, but this triumph offers little consolation to millions who died or suffered needlessly through no fault of their own for a never viable and now badly discredited cause.
This is like the most weaselly looking man ever. It's like such a perfect encapsulation of capitalism. Like, this is freedom when little weasels like this, who have never worked a day in their life, run everything and own everything, and you're not allowed to question their ideas. Otherwise, you're a conspiracy theorist. That's capitalism for you. And the Cold War didn't end with a bang. It did. It ended with a lot of bangs. The first one was the U.S. invaded Iraq in the Gulf Wars, that bombed Iraq to a pre-industrial state before putting sanctions on Iraq, which would lead to 500,000 plus deaths, which Madeleine Albright famously said was worth it on 60 Minutes. But Vijay Prashad says in Washington Bullets that as the U.S. was bombing Iraq's infrastructure, Saddam Hussein was like, what's going on? Where's the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union was in the UN Security Council, and they were providing this umbrella of protection over much of the Middle East and much of the global South. After the Soviet Union was dissolved, the U.S. was free to bomb infrastructure and massacre people without that umbrella of protection. So you have immediately the invasion of Panama, which kills a bunch of people and overthrows Noriega. And the Gulf War, followed by a series of interventions, including the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1998, and at the beginning of the 2000s, obviously the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the beginning of this quote unquote war on terror. But there was a huge uptick in U.S. interventionism and the brutality and the just like sheer like pig shit ignorance. We're not even going to justify this. We're just going to roll in and start killing people. That the U.S. started doing after the Soviet Union fell, and there was no longer that umbrella of protection.
Right, and not just like a physical bang, as all these things, but how can you see what happened to the people that lived in the former Soviet Union and not consider that a bang? That's the quickest lowering standard of living in the history of humanity. 40 million people tossed into poverty out of nowhere, right? The stuff that happens during this shock doctrine, this restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, is insane. The lives of people are destroyed. Prostitution runs rampant. Drugs run rampant. Oligarchs start popping up everywhere. Mafias and cartels. The country that was once owned by its people gets sold off to a bunch of billionaires, oligarchs. It all goes to shit. The people started living a lot shorter. Their life expectancy dropped by like 10 years. Infant mortality dropped. It was all horrible. It was horrible. And how you can speak about somehow there not being a boom, it's just complete ignorance of the situation, that not just what you mentioned, of course, right? The actual booms that the U.S. was able to wage all over the world now that the one major force that was defending colonial people was gone. But the boom that was affected by hundreds of millions of people that were now tossed into destitution after the fall of the Soviet Union.